was a very liberal institution. People often today forget that there was a period of about 1880 to 1940 when the churches were alive with liberal ideas. The idea that the virgin birth of Jesus could be questioned was quite widespread. People have seemed to have forgotten that period. And so I was brought up by theological teachers, therefore, who belonged to the liberal period. For example, one of my great heroes was a Swiss theologian called Emil Brunner. And he said the doctrine of the virgin birth of Jesus is in fact a danger to Christianity because it suggests that Jesus wasn't wholly human. Because all ordinary humans have both a father and a mother. And so that's the kind of surroundings in which I was trained. Now I had 3 parishes. I went to a little country parish, which was quite widespread. It went right up to the Southern Alps. And then I had a suburban parish in Dunedin, which included, by the way, the theological hall where I'd been trained. And so I had a staff coming up to church that I was now preaching at. And then I was in an inner city parish which had fallen on evil days and seemed to be declining. I enjoyed the parish ministry, but somehow I felt that we were not getting anywhere. And in this kind of frustration, I noticed that there was an advertisement in Queensland for a teacher in Old Testament. In the meantime, by the way, I had done an extra degree in Old Testament, just on the side. And so that was my first teaching appointment. And I changed from being a preacher to a teacher. In some respects, I, looking back, would feel that teaching skills were probably the skills I had more than that of being a pastor. And so I entered into that new kind of profession with great zeal. Now, I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll go quickly from there to my second teaching appointment, which was to come back to Knox College, where I had been trained, first as the professor of Old Testament there, and within 2 or 3 years as the principal of the college. And I enjoyed that very much. In the meantime, my own thinking had been advancing because I began to find out that even though it was a liberal college that I had been brought up in my naivety and being pretty fresh to the Christian tradition, I simply accepted everything they said. And of course I accepted too much. I hadn't been questioning enough. And once I began a teacher, I began now to question things. And that's even while I was in Queensland. I was influenced by the great New Testament scholar Rudolf Bultmann, who had questioned a whole lot of things in the New Testament. New Testament wasn't my field, but of course, as a Christian, as a church person, you had to cover everything. So I followed what he had to say and came to realise that there's nothing you can really know for certain about what Jesus said or what Jesus did. Indeed, there's a rather good story about Rudolf Bultmann that the archaeologists in Jerusalem had discovered the tomb in which Jesus had been buried, and his skeleton was still there. That caused a bit of a stir. And so they immediately sent to the Vatican the news, and they wondered what to do, and the Pope said, well, there's a very good New Testament scholar up there, we'll ask him for advice. So he rang up Rudolf Bultmann and said, Dr. Bultmann, and he told the story of what had been discovered. There was dead silence. Dr. Bultmann, you did hear what we said? And yes, he says, that is wonderful news. Jesus really lived. Took a completely different meaning from it, you see. So that was the kind of influences that were at work in my mind when I was asked to write an article for our church paper for Easter. And I had just been reading a book by a professor of theology at Glasgow, whom I had personally met, by the way, when he came to New Zealand. And in this book he said this: the Christian is free to say that the bones of Jesus lie in Palestine. And until the Christian feels free to say that, the Christian has not understood what it means to say he's risen from the dead. So I write an article explaining what was behind this. And when the article appeared, you'd think I'd blown the roof off the church. There was a tremendous kerfuffle followed that. And it soon broke out of the Presbyterian. And all the churches, I remember going to seminars in which Catholics were trying to defend the traditional position. And our church tried to get over it by passing at General Assembly a certain statement which carefully avoided all the problems. You know, the church has a way of doing that, it papered over the cracks, and so that both sides of the debate were reasonably happy with it, and we thought that was over. Well, it should have been, but the next year I was invited to preach at the opening service of the Victoria University of Wellington. I wasn't up there then, I later became. And I preached on Ecclesiastes, and Ecclesiastes, of course, takes a fairly realistic view of our humanity and our finiteness, and says that when we die, that's the end that comes. Man has no immortal soul. The next morning, theologian says man has no immortal soul. And the journalist concerned then rang up all the leading church people, bishops and so on. What was their response? Oh, they were all completely shocked by this. So the whole discussion blew up again. And this time, it was the year 1967, everybody in New Zealand, or all around the bars, we're talking, what happens to you when you die? We had a marvellous theological debate that was worldwide, it was nationwide. As I later said to the church, you're always complaining you don't get any publicity. Now you've got it, you want to close the whole thing down. Because I was charged by two particular people. One charged me with teaching false doctrine, but the other one, who actually was quite a good theologian himself, the other one charged me with disturbing the peace of the church. And that has been the problem with the church in many ways over the last 150 years. As new thinking and new knowledge has emerged, and the church has come to terms with it sometimes at the theological level, but has not let it disseminate into the pew for fear of disturbing the peace of the church. Well, as Francis said, I was acquitted of teaching false doctrine, but the church was never the same again. And I